Imagine meeting someone for the first time, and before they tell you their name, before they tell you what they do, they tell you this: I am sick. I am bitter. I am not a likable person. That's it. That's the introduction. That's exactly how Dostoevsky opens one of the strangest, most uncomfortable books ever written. Not with a scene, not with a plot, with a confession of everything wrong with the narrator, stated flatly, almost proudly, before we know anything else about him. And here's the question that should bother you. Why would anyone choose to introduce themselves that way? What kind of person leads with their worst qualities instead of hiding them? By the end of this, you'll understand, and you might recognize a piece of yourself in the answer. The book is Notes from the Underground, published in 1864 by Fyodor Dostoevsky. At the time, Russian intellectual culture was falling in love with an idea that human beings are fundamentally rational, and if you could just align people's self-interest correctly, you could engineer a kind of social paradise. Remove suffering, remove irrationality, optimize the species. Dostoevsky hated this idea, and he built an entire character to destroy it from the inside. That character is the underground man, unnamed, mid-40s, a former low-level civil servant who inherited a small amount of money and immediately quit his job to live alone in a shabby apartment. He's intelligent, painfully self-aware, and almost completely incapable of functioning around other people. Here's a detail most people miss. The word underground in the English title is actually a mistranslation. The more accurate image is a crawlspace, the gap beneath a floor too small for a person where insects and rodents live. That's how the underground man describes his own existence. He even says that listening to other people talk feels like listening through a crack in the floorboards. He's not above society looking down. He's beneath it, looking up through a gap, close enough to hear everything and touch nothing. This matters because it reframes his isolation. It's not exile, it's self-burial. Now here's where it gets philosophically dangerous. The underground man watches the rational optimists of his era, the ones who think math can solve happiness, and he makes a claim that still unsettles people today. Humans don't actually want pure happiness. They want freedom even when freedom makes them miserable. Give a person every comfort, every pleasure, a life with nothing left to struggle against, he argues, and out of pure spite, they'll find a way to ruin it. Not because they're broken, because predictability itself is a kind of cage. He goes further. He says man loves the act of building roads more than he loves the roads themselves. The destination bores him. It's the chaos of the unfinished thing that makes him feel alive. So he says all this, but does he live it? The second half of the book answers that brutally. First memory. An officer humiliates him in a pub by physically moving him aside like he's furniture. For years afterward, the underground man stalks this man's daily walking route, obsessing over a way to assert equality. Eventually he borrows money he doesn't have to buy an expensive coat, just so he can bump into the officer on the street as an equal. The officer doesn't even notice him, walks right past, and somehow that almost destroys him more than if he'd been insulted directly. Second memory. He forces his way into a dinner with old schoolmates who don't really want him there. He arrives early, they arrive late, and by the time they show up he's already furious. The dinner collapses into him screaming his contempt for all of them. They leave without him off to a brothel. He follows anyway, uninvited, still burning with rage. Third memory. At that brothel, he meets a young woman named Liza. They sleep together, and afterward, lying in the dark, he does something almost cruel for no reason. He describes her future to her in detail. Poverty, disease, and undignified death. He gives her his address as if daring her to test whether he meant any of it as kindness. She actually comes. Before we get to what happens when she shows up, it's worth pausing on why this story keeps pulling you forward, because the mechanics matter as much as the plot. The opening question, why introduce yourself with your flaws, is still unanswered. That's an open loop, and your brain doesn't like unanswered questions. It keeps low-grade tension running until it's closed. Each scene in the last section answers a why would he do that from the scene before it, and immediately raises a new one. That's a curiosity chain. Not a single twist, smaller hooks stacked end to end, so there's never a flat moment to lose interest in. Then there's the relatability hook, the split between the man of action, who never overthinks, and the underground man, who overthinks everything into paralysis. A lot of people privately recognize themselves in that second category, and once you do, this stops being a story about a stranger. There's also restrained authority, short, exact phrases pulled from the original text, never long enough to feel like a lecture, just enough to remind you this isn't speculation. It's the character's own words. And underneath all of it is taboo fascination. The uncomfortable idea that someone starved of real love might mistake domination and humiliation for intimacy, because it's the only kind of intensity they've ever been given. So Liza arrives at his apartment, and he is mortified not because she came, but because of what her arrival means. In front of her, in that dinner table outburst and the brothel that followed, he'd performed a kind of dark heroism. Now she's standing in his actual life. A cramped apartment, mid-argument with his own servant, nothing heroic about him at all. He realizes she came because she pitied him, and pity to him is unbearable. So he turns on her, tells her he was mocking her the whole time, that none of it was real. She leaves in tears. And then, alone, he breaks down too, admitting only to himself that all he ever wanted was power over another person, because it was the only form of closeness he understood. He runs into the street after her. He doesn't find her. Sit with that for a second. A man who finally has a chance at human connection destroys it with his own hands, then chases after what he destroyed, too late. So let's go back to the opening question. Why does he introduce himself and this entire book? By listing everything ugly about himself first. Because that's the one freedom nobody can engineer out of him. Remember the utopians from earlier, the ones trying to optimize human beings into rational, predictable, happy creatures. The underground man's entire existence is a rebellion against that. He'd rather be honestly miserable than dishonestly comfortable. His suffering isn't a malfunction to be fixed. It's evidence that he still has a will of his own, even when that will only ever points inward at himself. That's the thesis stated plainly. He didn't fail to live a normal life. He refused to live the only way he was told a person could. The book doesn't end with resolution. Dostoevsky himself cuts it off with a small note saying there was more to the notes. But we may stop here. No redemption. No clean ending. Just a man, alone again, having proven his own theory of human nature using himself as the only test subject. So here's the question to actually sit with after this video ends. Has there ever been something good in your life? A relationship, an opportunity, a moment of real connection that you sabotaged, not because you didn't want it, but because keeping it felt like losing control? The underground man would tell you that's not weakness. That's the only freedom he ever had.